Hello, and welcome to Documents in Detail, a webinar and podcast series that explores the core documents of American history. Today we are joined by our host, John Moser of Ashland University, and panelists Eric Sands of Berry College and Abigail Vector, also of Berry College. In honor of the upcoming 2022 congressional elections, we've chosen to focus this episode on the evolution of party politics and in particular on the political machines of the late 19th century. Join us as we take a deep dive into honest graft and the emergence of a Social Security network in Plunkitt of Tammany Hall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Moser. I am Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History and Political Science, as well as of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. I would like to welcome you all to another edition. It is the first episode of, I don't know, is this our 6th or 7th season or something like that? Anyway, it's Documents in Detail, Teaching American History's webinar series in which we bring together thoughtful scholars to have a conversation about historically significant documents. We encourage all of you joining us this evening to participate in that conversation by submitting questions via the Q&A box. Please, not the chat box. I just want to be able to check one place, so please use Q&A. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. Within the next week, you'll be receiving an email with links for further reading, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from tonight's program. The speeches, letters, and other writings that we're using for this year's webinars are all drawn from the various volumes in our core documents series. They are also available at the teachingamericanhistory.org's extensive, indeed voluminous document database located at tah.org. The subject of tonight's program comes from the volume on political parties. Here it is, edited by Eric Sands. The document we're going to be discussing is Plunkitt of Tammany Hall. To help discuss it are Eric Sands himself. Eric is Associate Professor of Political Science and Department Chair of Political Science and International Affairs. He is joined by Abigail Vector, Assistant Professor of Political Science. You were both at Berry College, correct?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So before we get too much farther into this, I'm asking that everyone do me a favor, take a moment to answer the two questions that are going to be coming up on your screen. There they are. Our staff at TAH is trying to get a sense of what type of professional development we should offer to our webinar participants. Your feedback will help us determine how to best serve our fine audience of educators. All right. So I'll give it a couple seconds for that. Maybe I should answer this too. I have not taken one of our graduate courses. I've taught them many times. All right. Eric, Abby, glad you could be with us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
This is a super juicy document. I'm wondering if maybe you could each start out by saying a bit about, especially you, Eric, since you're the editor of the volume. What is so great about this document that it merits inclusion among, I don't know how many are in this volume, 38 documents. So it's a pretty select group. Why this merits inclusion among that 38 select?
Oh, I mean, it's a great question. The Plunkitt, this is just an excerpt of a larger work a series of lectures that Plunkitt delivered. And it really puts on display a lot of how ward bosses in the big cities operated during the heyday of political parties, or the golden age of parties, which roughly 1876 to 1896. Plunkitt was a character, which is evident from the reading. Very, very funny guy, well loved by his constituents, very popular in his city. But what he reflects in the essay is, I think, something that is reflective of how a lot of these ward bosses and a lot of these party bosses, sort of understood how they operated in these major cities. That my corruption is good for everybody, which is sort of the argument in a nutshell. So, I mean, in part, it's making an argument that it's not really corruption because nobody's getting hurt. Nobody's getting screwed over. I'm just taking advantage of opportunities when they come along. And so most of it is examples of things like, what we would call insider trading. He points out later on in the lectures and stuff that the budget books always balance. When they come in and do the audits, all the money is accounted for. So nobody's stealing from the public till. But he says, I get these opportunities as it comes along to make a profit, to make a little money on the side. And, I do what any sane individual would do in my position. I take advantage of it. But what gets lost sometimes, so, I mean, in part, this is a nice representation of the way parties are oftentimes portrayed in the latter part of the 19th century. People think of parties at that time, they think of corruption. There's more to the story, though, because that corruption served a purpose. That money wasn't just going to line Plunkitt's pockets. It was also going to serve the needs of his constituents. That money's being used to buy, turkeys for his constituents at Thanksgiving, hams at Christmas. It's paying for funerals for indigents or for people who can't afford funerals. It's paying for, people to help find jobs, to provide housing, to provide education to immigrants. So, I mean, it's, the parties are doing a lot of the social welfare services that government is not doing at this point. And the way they're going to fund themselves is going to be through these, corrupt acts that they're engaged in. It's not such a simple thing to just look at it and say, oh my goodness, I can't believe somebody would act that way, and that these party officials are so corrupt. That corruption ends up benefiting an awful lot of people, and I think that's one of the reasons the constituents tolerated it, because they knew they directly benefited from it, and why public officials tended to look the other way.
Abby, care to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, ditto to what Eric said. One, it's a really fun piece. I teach urban politics, and we always read this piece, and students always love it. Just the honesty with which we see someone writing about their activity that may or may not seem legitimate is somewhat refreshing for students, and they always really enjoy it. And like Eric said, it kind of paints this picture of political parties during this era that, yes, in some ways reflects common complaints we hear today about modern political parties, but also reflects this embeddedness that these politicians at this time had in their communities that we don't see in the same way. As Eric mentioned, this honest graph that he's talking about is going to fund the needs of the community, but the intimate needs, right? He knows who has passed away and can't afford a carriage for the funeral. He knows which family needs the turkeys during Christmas time. And it's a really nice kind of foil to the social reformers that come after kind of this era, who for the most part were outsiders coming in and weren't aware of these same community needs. They weren't as intimately embedded into these districts as the ward bosses were during this particular era. So it's kind of a nice foil to what comes next too. And I found that students really enjoy reading it.
All right, thanks. So maybe you could give us a bit of background about Plunkitt himself, as well as the institution known as Tammany Hall. either or both of you?
Yeah, well, I mean, Tammany goes back to, the American founding. It was started out as a kind of social organization that grew into a very powerful political organization in New York City. Martin Van Buren was a major figure in the development of Tammany and in creating it as probably New York's most important and most powerful political force. And when he goes national in the 1820s, Tammany is left a very powerful machine in New York. And it never really ceases to be one until we get into the 20th century and we start having the reform of the city machines that starts taking place, especially civil service reform, where we're going to replace the patronage system and the spoils system. So Plunkitt kind of fits in among, Tammany and its many charismatic, ward bosses and city leaders. Certainly not nearly as corrupt as Tweed. Tweed is oftentimes held up as the image of the boss in this time period, and the fact was he was so ridiculously corrupt that even party leaders didn't really take him very seriously. They were, for the most part, quite relieved when he got carted off to prison and was replaced by John Kelly, who basically found Tammany Hall a hoard when he came in, and he reformed it and turned it into a political army, and it became a model for party organization in other cities around the country. But there's even vestiges of Tammany in New York today. It's not what it once was, but the old Democratic Party still has, for the most part, ironclad control over the city. And has a lot of linkages to public offices and control over a lot of goods and services in the city. So I think that legacy is still today somewhat intact.
Yeah, for sure. And I would second everything that Eric said. The nice thing about using this particular document and this particular story in teaching this era is it is somewhat representative of other machines throughout the country, right? I'm from Kansas City originally, so we love to talk about the Pendergast machine. We always get to talk about Truman a little bit in my classes, and that's always a fun thing to do, and how he was linked to the Pendergast for a while. But to be able to draw parallels between Plunkitt and Tammany Hall and other political machines, especially in key urban cores throughout the United States, is another reason why this document is so helpful.
It seems to me that one difference between the kind of control that the Democratic Party has today versus back then was Tammany did not reign supreme, right? I mean, every now and again you had coalitions of reformers and Republicans who would come along. He even mentions the election of 1901, which was a disaster for them. Say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I know that sometimes when Eric teaches this piece, we kind of pair it with the Why the Ward Boss Rules piece by Jane Addams from 1898. And that's kind of a really great pairing to this piece too, because she speaks to this new strategy that they kind of have coming in to try and defeat Tammany Hall and the stronghold they have in their city, and how they can be successful and what they need to do to be competitive in these districts. And as you mentioned, right, they experience some success, and Tammany Hall is left kind of having to respond to that. And again, capitalizing on the fact that these are outsiders who are coming in trying to be competitive. We are from here, we are embedded in this community. But as you mentioned, it's not a stone cold grasp on the election outcomes. And I think that Jane Addams' piece kind of points to why we see that competition happening again at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, and why we start to see that competition grow.
Eric?
Yeah, Tammany could get out of step with public opinion. There's certainly no question about that. You see a number of instances where Whigs and then later Republicans win control of the state of New York, and it's only the city the Democrats still control, and it's usually the Democrats in Tammany are running the state as well. But that's not always the case. And one great example of this is in 1860. The city of New York, under Tammany's leadership, tries to secede. They try to join the secession movement. They even send delegates to the Confederate Constitutional Convention, and try to have input into how the Constitution is going to be written. Eventually, they back off of this and they quiet down. But it's kind of remarkable how much independence they sometimes had. But they did run into obstacles at times and had to recalibrate and find out how to reacclimate themselves with the electorate.
That's really interesting. I'm wondering, did Tammany have any connection to the draft riots in 1863?
I believe they had some connection to them. Tammany struggled mightily, as most Democrats did during the war, with trying to figure out how to maintain themselves as the legitimate opposition. And I mean, it was I have to admit, after over a decade of research on the Civil War and Reconstruction, I've gained a certain amount of sympathy for the Copperheads in the North, for the position they were in. It is very hard to be an opposition party during wartime, especially during the Civil War. How do you express saying, hey, we're for the Union, but we're against every conceivable way this war is being prosecuted, without being called traitors? And that was a very fine line that they had to walk. And they didn't always do it successfully.
This is something I've encountered in my own research on the anti-interventionist movement in World War II. After Pearl Harbor, the America First Committee doesn't really know what to do, and there's a debate: do we keep going and then become critics of the administration while still saying we need to fight the Japanese, or do we fold? And eventually those in favor of folding won out. There's a question from Andrew Nappy. How might Plunkitt's behaviors parallel the land speculation that our founders engaged in during the early years of the Republic in the Ohio country?
Well, I'd say one difference is that a lot of the land speculation was simply for, self-gain. It was, various members of the founding generation looking to make a profit, to fill their own bank accounts. They weren't looking to benefit others in what they were doing. Whereas, when you're talking about people like Plunkitt, and I certainly don't want to suggest there aren't party leaders who are not out there who are just about, self-gratification. There certainly were, but for somebody like Plunkitt, who I think was more of the archetype of a ward boss, it's about some measure of self-interest, but there's also a big measure here of serving their constituents, of trying to contribute to the public good, and that's the part I think, as I said, gets overlooked. Is there's a real concerted effort here to contribute to the betterment of society, and that's one of the things he's trying to do. They need resources to do this, though, and this is one of the easy ways that we can get those resources.
Abby?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, you think about even his argument here, right? I saw opportunities, I took them, but this money is going towards you all, right? Don't let these people come in and tell you that what I'm doing here isn't for you. It is, right? And that truth comes out at Christmas time, at Thanksgiving, when you're sick, when you're in need. And that is something that is indicative of a lot of the machines at this time. And I think, as Eric mentioned earlier, this is a time in which the government is not providing for the social welfare in a way we understand it to today. These parties were operating as a social safety net in these urban centers, and it does make them distinct. And it's important to kind of remember why they were doing this, right? And again, I don't want to come across as saying this corruption was all great and we can excuse it all away because of the outcomes, right? That's not the case. But I do think saying this corruption was solely for self-interest, solely for Plunkitt's own quality of life, if you will, is ignoring a key part to this story.
I've done a little bit of research into Charlie Murphy, and my sense is that Richard Croker was actually almost as bad as Boss Tweed, and then Murphy comes along and kind of, it's almost like there's a pattern here with Tammany. You've got the guy who pushes things too far, and then the leadership realizes that we've got to fix something, and then you've got someone like a Plunkitt or in the later in the 20th century, a Murphy who cleans things up a bit. Is that a fair characterization?
Oh, I think that's exactly right. And I think, there's something kind of predictable about that. The spoils, get so tempting for the party leaders that they just start dipping into the till anywhere and everywhere they can find it. And so you do have, you do have the Tweeds and others that, are stealing from the city. They're taking from the public budget. They're doing all kinds of, very illegal things in order to put money away and to aggrandize themselves. And then, you do have these kind of party reformers that come along and, are sort of on a platform of needing to clean up things, getting the party streamlined, getting it efficient once again. And so, yeah, I as I had mentioned with Kelly, I mean, that was, that was what drew people to his leadership was, Tweed was an embarrassment. I mean, he was, there's no way around it. He was just an embarrassment. And so people wanted someone to come along and kind of clean things up and, return the party to its former glory.
Yeah, and part of this too that I think hasn't really been included in the conversation thus far is how these party bosses were able to maintain power, right? We're talking about corruption in terms of finances here, but there was also a lot of corruption when it comes to votes, and that's something we certainly can't ignore in this part of the story too. And as those social reformers came in, it was certainly about stopping stealing from the public budget, right? But it was also about voter reform in really consequential ways, in ways that we still certainly feel today.
Got a couple more questions from our viewers. David Shine asks, regarding the cities, the urban machines, did they commonly look to state and national capitals for funds, or did they have to raise all, maybe he's not talking about machines, but city government in general. Did they commonly look to state and national capitals for funds, or did they have to raise all their own taxable monies?
Specifically in this era of the end of the 19th century? Is that what he's asking?
That's the question is non-specific.
Yeah, no worries. So there is some variation here that across the country, right, that needs to be acknowledged. Something that I always talk about in urban politics is I think we forget how neglected our cities were by state and national government during this era, and one can argue continuing on through history, right? We're talking about entities that have no real constitutional authority and are really subjected to state and national control, but often in ways in which are unfunded, right? So There's certainly variation. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush there, but for the most part, when we're characterizing cities and city governments during this time and beyond, right, there's a lot of self-reliance that needs to take place. And Eric, you can jump into if you have more specifics about this.
No, that's exactly right. And the only thing I'd add to that is that one of the things we don't really realize in this contemporary era of national parties is that parties were highly localized in the 19th century. That's where the real power was. There was actually very little power at the national level. And that's also where the bulk of fundraising took place, was at the local level. And the money would kind of trickle upwards rather than coming in at the national level and trickling downwards. So the localities and the cities were, in fact, very powerful in the party system. Because they were the ones drawing in, all of this money, through dues and assessments and, all kinds of contributions from wealthy individuals. And, that was the stuff that the state parties and the national parties would be able to make use of in elections and for, other party purposes. So there's a lot of deference that's going on to these bosses and to what's happening in these cities.
And one could make the argument too that this is when the parties are at their strongest, right? The self-reliance piece of these urban centers allows them a lot of, as Eric said, power, right? And that's reflected in the power of the parties themselves. This is a golden era, right, for political parties in the United States. And part of that is due to its localized nature.
How much power did machines like Tammany, and we can think of other, Kansas City or whatever, how much influence did they have at a national level? How much did they have to do with, for instance, the choosing of presidential candidates?
Well, as you get into the latter part of the 19th century, the party bosses, of course, played a very significant role in the selection of presidential nominees. In fact, they were the ones at the conventions who are in the proverbial smoke-filled rooms, sipping brandy and talking amongst themselves about who the nominees should be. And then once the bosses reach a consensus, they go out and dictate to the delegates who they're going to support and who they're going to vote for. The Republicans tended to be a little more successful on this model than the Democrats because the Democrats had adopted the 2/3 rule when the convention system was first started. And that meant, of course, needing to get 2/3 of the delegate votes. It wasn't always so easy to get all the bosses on the same page, or even when they were, some of the delegates could defect and still throw the convention into some turmoil in terms of getting an eventual nominee. But it is kind of remarkable how much influence the bosses wielded over these national processes. They also had a say-so with the Senate in political appointments at the national level. So they would submit names of people that they wanted to have selected for positions in the federal bureaucracy. So they certainly did have a major impact and a major influence in national politics and in American politics overall.
Yeah, and if we're looking to specific, not to be too Kansas City for you all, but if we're looking to specific examples, right, later on in the 20th century, in the 40s, right, we see Truman is launched essentially by boss Tom Pendergast, right? He kind of sneakily refers to it as the Democratic organization in Kansas City, but we're talking about Pendergast, and we're talking about the Pendergast machine, who was essential in bringing him to the presidency.
Okay. And imagine before the 17th Amendment, when it's state legislatures that are choosing the senators, then machines would have had a huge impact.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Another question from David Shine, and one that I'm going to build on a little bit. David asks, how did Plunkitt and Tammany build coalitions of different ethnic groups? And my gloss on this is, when I think about the golden age of Tammany, I think Irish. but they couldn't have, or I don't think they could have, had such support if it were just the Irish they were working with. So how do the Irish reach beyond their own specific group to win over, especially as we're getting toward the end of the 19th century, Italians, Germans, East Europeans of various types? How do they manage that?
In short, I mean, everyone was getting a turkey, right? I mean, it wasn't limited to the ethnic groups of the leaders at that time. There were needs to be met, and the organization wasn't really deciding who got a turkey, who didn't, depending on ethnicity at that time.
Yeah, and it's also important to remember that for a long time, the Democratic Party in New York, made their bones on the support of immigrants. So it wasn't really about ethnicity as much as it was getting these immigrants to support the Democratic Party by forming attachments to them right off the boat. So one of the first things that would oftentimes happen, instant naturalization. They'd get a judge to come down to the docks, and in one fell swoop, you're all American citizens. Oh, and by the way, we have an election today.
let me take you to the polls.
So we're going to take you to the polls, and you can vote early and often. And as you're there,
go shave, and we'll come back and get you.
Yeah, I mean, that routinely happened, and they would help these immigrants with finding housing. They would help them in finding jobs. They'd help them with the language barriers. They had, parties had resources devoted to helping the immigrants learn English so they could be more competitive in the economy. But during elections, they made special appeals to reaching out to immigrants. They would release party, pamphlets and materials in hundreds of different languages. Appealing to all of the different ethnic groups strewn around the city. So that's really it. And so the Whigs and then later the Republicans, they go through a lot of turmoil trying to figure out how to respond to this, because on one hand they argue that they want to try to make inroads among these immigrants, but a lot of their party coalitions are very anti-immigrant. They don't really want the immigrants here in the first place. So they can't really cozy themselves up to these immigrants coming in. And of course, they just don't have a whole lot of influence in a lot of the big cities anyway. So it seems sort of like a lost cause to try to win them over.
Just letting everyone know, we have a completely open queue. So if anybody has questions, there have been some episodes of this show where we've just had way too many questions that we could answer. That does not appear to be the case tonight. So if you have a question, please get it in there. I want to ask something related to my previous, or to David's previous point. It involves religion. I get the sense that, certainly by the later part of the 19th century, Tammany is very much has a Roman Catholic vibe to it. Does that in any way pose problems for the kind of coalition that they're building, or is the coalition overwhelmingly Catholic anyway, so it doesn't much matter?
Yeah, my understanding is the coalition is overwhelmingly Catholic at this time, but also votes were votes, right? They weren't drawing distinctions among these individuals. If you were coming in and if you were going to show loyalty to the machine, there weren't these same divisions within. I'm not saying there were cultural clashes, because certainly there were. We're talking about a lot of people in a small place, right? Very close together. But for the machine's sake, they weren't drawing those same distinctions between their constituents. If you could get here and you could get to the polls, you were good to go. And Eric, you may be able to speak to a little bit more about what the makeup looked like of the machine at that time. But my understanding is that there weren't those same distinctions that were drawn.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. You know, that for the most part, the Republican Party was the party of Protestantism, and you know, generally far more so than the Whigs were kind of willing to not give in to a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, so that doesn't become as much of a division in the latter part of the 19th century as it did in the beginning of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. So like compared to the Whigs trying to grapple with the know-nothings, mm-hmm. You know, with, you know, where we have the Catholic riots going on in cities, and you know, people are actually getting killed over this kind of stuff. The Republicans are more subdued about their Protestantism, but it is still very much a Protestant party, and you know, Catholicism is going to be lodged firmly with the Democrats, even though there is sort of cross religious lines in the Democratic Party as well, but they're more harmonious. They're just able to manage the religious conflict better than the Republicans are.
Yeah, of course, Tammany produces probably the best known Catholic of the 1920s. Al Smith comes out of the Tammany tradition and goes on to be a presidential candidate. So.
Yeah.
Thea Burris, hi Thea. She asks, how does Plunkitt relate to Huey Long? Seems like there are some similarities. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there are some similarities between them. You know, Huey Long is obviously on a much bigger stage than Plunkitt is. Plunkitt is a ward boss in New York. He's got a relatively small constituency compared to being governor of Louisiana and concurrently being senator from Louisiana. And then you know, being seriously considered as a presidential candidate. And you know, the what if he had not been assassinated, would that have resulted in a possible viable presidential run? But the populism that's at work there, I think crosses over between the two. You know, giving the people what they want, you know, attending to the people's desires, tending to their needs, having this view that I really know what the people want and need, and I'm the only one that can provide it, and trying to sell people on that image that I'm the only one that can provide this to you. I think there's a very strong linkage between those two models.
Yeah, no, I would agree with what Eric shared as well. I mean, we don't want to oversell, right, Plunkitt's influence during this time. He is a very interesting character and one that had a lot of power, and one that is representative of a lot of what how the parties were operating during this time. But as you say, kind of putting him in his right size is important when making those comparisons too.
So Gloria Sesso has a question. I'm going to mess with that a little bit. She wants to know about how Tammany and the political bosses lost their power. I think this is a big question. We've talked about how the machines such as Tammany made for a more vibrant, dynamic party culture than what we have today. We also talked about how this was a system that, in theory anyway, benefited not just the bosses, but everyone. You knew, right, that you knew the boss could provide turkeys and he'd throw parties. And there's another great chapter from, obviously you can't include the whole damn thing in this collection, but another chapter about the life of a ward boss and how many hours, I'm not talking about the boss at this point, but just sort of the lieutenants, I guess, who are out there pounding the pavement, who find out who. Yeah, maybe you want to say something about that in the course of getting to this question. Okay, if it made for a more vibrant and dynamic party culture, a more fun politics, and it worked for everybody, why in the world did it go away?
Well, worked for everyone except those who were losing during this time, right? We had, the social reformers, Jane Addams at this time, other people in this camp who were coming in, noting the corruption and really trying to challenge the way this party system was working. I don't know if any of them would come in saying their intention was to make the parties boring, right? And to kind of decrease the fun and the excitement and the energy surrounding the parties during this time. I think that was, most people would say that was probably unintended consequences of the reform they brought with them. But they were also, they tended to be middle-class people who were coming in, felt as if they had the moral high ground on these immigrants, on these people of lower socioeconomic status of this time, and said, hey, let us come in and fix this corrupt system that you think is benefiting from you, or benefiting you, but is not, right? And a lot of those reforms that were implemented in the early 20th century are sort of responsible for the eventual decline and weakening of our political party system. Again, maybe less so with the intention of, I love how you talk about the parties as fun, right? Because they were, I mean, it was a big party. These were times when neighborhoods were getting together and eating and drinking and being in community with one another in a really vibrant societal life. And I don't think the intention was to diminish that, but that was certainly an unintended consequence.
Yeah, Abby's exactly right. It's impossible to underestimate how dynamic the parties were at this time. So one of the measures that really stands out is voter turnout. Mm-hmm. So during this era, voter turnout is exceeding 80%. I mean, 8 out of every 10 voters are turning out to vote. When you talk about us on a good election, getting about 55%. Of voters turning out. The parties did an almost miraculous job at turning people out to vote. And I remember when parties were still a dynamic presence in New York City, and there's sort of some vestiges of Tammany still left. My grandmother grew up in Brooklyn, talking about Election Day in New York, and the parties are there at 9 o'clock in the morning when the polls open, at your door knocking. We have an election today. When are you coming out to vote? I'm getting breakfast together and get some errands to run, but I'll be down later. Okay, if you need anything, if you need transportation, if you need us to look after the kids for a while, whatever we can do for you, we'll bring. So, noon rolls around, knock, knock, knock. Notice you still haven't made it to the polls. Sure, we can't help you out and get you down. I mean, they were just persistent, just legions of party workers out there. And I mean, when you got down to the polling precinct, I mean, there's a barbecue going on. There's rides for the kids. I mean, it's a carnival atmosphere. It's like the whole election day is a big celebration. Mm-hmm. You made elections like that today. I bet you could increase turnout. You actually made it enjoyable to vote instead of these sort of like sterile voting conditions that we're in now. But I would add a couple of things to what Abby said about what happens to the bosses and to the machine parties. The Australian ballot comes along. So we now have voters voting in private instead of publicly. So prior to this, you basically put your ballot in a box. And so everybody knew how you cast your ballot. And that was important if you were getting a patronage position. The party had to know that its corruption was going to pay off. And now they can't be sure of that. You've promised somebody $100 to vote for you. You want to make sure that they're going to vote that way. And now you can't. So that takes, that takes a lot of the steam out of the party sails. Civil service reform in the cities, taking the patronage away from the parties. That takes a lot of their resources away from them, which dries up a lot of the opportunities. that they have to secure the loyalty of voters there. And I'd add in just rising educational levels in the country. People come to see that they don't need to rely on political parties to know how to vote the way that they did in the past. That they're just, I can make my own mind up about who I'm voting for. And that also, of course, opens the door to things like split ticket voting. So I'm not even going to vote a straight party ticket anymore. So I think there's a number of dynamics at work there that it explains why the parties taper off in the cities.
I remember reading Clark Clifford and George Elsey wrote this famous memo to Truman about the upcoming 1948 campaign and said, it's not about the machines anymore. It's about mobilizing interest groups. We got to have labor and the farmers and African Americans. These have to be on our side. The machines are about done for. A question I wanted to ask though: how does the saloon fit into Tammany and machine politics in general?
You got it, Eric.
I didn't hear the.
Sorry, how does the saloon, right, the institution of the saloon and liquor in general and beer, some of my favorite subjects, fit in with the life of the political machines at Tammany in particular?
Well, so one of the first things I'd say is voting often took place in saloons. It was one of the places which would be awesome, by the way.
Bring it back.
Do you know how much easier 2016 would have been if I could have voted in a saloon? But the saloons are gathering places for people to be able to converse, to talk about days events, for the parties to disseminate propaganda. The parties, for the people who couldn't read, the parties would oftentimes place an individual in the saloons who would read newspapers to the room, so people could catch up on the news of the day. Now, of course, it was a party newspaper, so they're not getting objective news; they're getting it through a partisan lens. But they're still able to be kind of informed about what's going on. The saloons were also places where the parties were very instrumental in putting together the marching clubs that would march in the torchlight parades. They usually were formed out of groups of men at the saloons who would solicit a wealthy benefactor, and then they'd get the matching uniforms, and they'd practice marching. And then they would lead these parades that would have tens of thousands of people, marching behind them with torches in the evening. I mean, the spectacle had to have been just beyond description. It's one of my wishes would have been to be able to go back and see one of these torchlight parades, because I think the spectacle itself must have just been overwhelming to see. But everybody lined up to see what's going on, and and now sometimes they would get a wealthy benefactor to support them, and then they'd blow all the money on alcohol, and wouldn't actually put together a marching club. But that was a risk you ran when you supported one of these groups.
And I think the picture we're painting here of this era is really how central political parties were to community life, and the saloons were sort of the setting with which these activities took place, right? So if we think about it as a story, we have these wonderful characters, and the saloon is a really central setting in which many of these activities take place.
Would you say then that prohibition is more a cause of the decline of the machine or a consequence of it?
Well, Kansas City, fun fact, didn't really have prohibition. The Pendergast made sure that was the case. So in some...
New York City, right? It was barely enforced in New York City.
Right. Right. And so I don't know how consequential it was, and Eric may be able to speak more to that history than I can. I don't get the sense that it really had too much of an impact. It was a way to maybe contradict an us versus them sort of dynamic for the conflict that was taking place between the party bosses and these social reformers coming in. But as for impacting their activity, I don't get the sense that it had that large of an impact.
Yeah, I agree with Abby on that. Although one significant thing that Prohibition did do was tie the political parties into organized crime.
True.
And the illicit activities that were going on in especially places like Chicago and New York, and other locales and stuff, that provided new opportunities for corruption and corrupt behavior that the progressive reformers thought they had rooted out, and Prohibition kind of brought it back onto the radar again.
Interesting. Gloria Sisso asks, to what extent could we really say Tammany was a small d democratic organization?
Ooh.
Yeah, not really.
Yeah.
So let me answer that this way. Pre 1860 Tammany Hall and post 1860 Tammany Hall. Pre 1860 Tammany was, largely a little d democratic organization, as the parties were in general. They were highly participatory. The conventions were highly participatory. The people were actively involved in party life. Representatives from the parties constantly took their bearing from public opinion. And the parties are serving as conduits of communication between the people and their elected representatives. So they're all kind of tied together, and public opinion is very important to the parties. I think that becomes less the case after 1860, and as we get into this golden age of parties. The party, well, part of the problem is the parties just become massive organizations. I mean, we're talking about organizations with millions and millions and millions of people. And you can't run an organization like that democratically. It has to be hierarchical. You have to have a few people making decisions on behalf of everybody. And that's essentially what happens with the boss system, is, the bosses, are making the big decisions for the people underneath them, who are then making those decisions for the people beneath them. And it's very militaristic in its overall organizational structure.
Okay, well, we're coming to the end of our time. One question that I always like to ask toward the end: we've got an audience, mostly, if not entirely, made up of teachers. What is the best pitch you can make for why they should find room in their busy curricula to have their students look at this document?
Yeah, so this is, as we kind of said at the beginning, it's a fun one, and I'm always a sucker for including something fun that the students are going to be engaged and interested in. But it also sheds some light on an era that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and confusion about. When my students come to me at the college level, there's a lot of confusion around the story of political parties in America. We understand them a little bit in the modern context, but as for their history in the United States, there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of confusion about kind of the era of its strength, and then how they became kind of the weakened institutions that we see them to be today. And so this is a great opportunity to kind of open that conversation and talk about this golden era of political parties that often gets overlooked and does have real consequences for the political system today.
That's a great way of putting it. That was one of my major reasons for wanting to include it in the volume was to kind of shed some light onto this period of time that I have found my students don't seem to know that much about, and come in, as Abby said, with very, very misguided understandings of parties and party politics during this particular era. And, it's what it doesn't matter what level party class I'm teaching, undergraduate, graduate, one of the goals is always to let parties stand, for themselves as they were in the 19th century. To give people a taste of what party life was really like in the 19th century. And I think that's one of the things this document does really well, is it gives a very strong flavor to the psychology of parties and party bosses, and revealing the two sides, the obvious corruption, which the kids already know about, but the social welfare function of the parties that they don't know about. And one of the great things about this document is asking the kids, do the ends justify the means here? Yeah, would you be supportive of a ward boss engaging in this kind of behavior, given the good that comes out of it? Or would you be, one of those progressive reformers who just sees corruption in this and wants to end it at all cost? Which view would you take? And I have found very enlightening and very robust debates that have gone on in my classes over that question.
Oh, John, I think you're muted.
That was bound to happen eventually, right? I want to thank both of our panelists, Eric and Abby. I also want to thank our participants for their questions. If you did not have an opportunity to take the professional development poll at the beginning of the webinar, it's back again. Somebody said that they couldn't see it. I hope that problem is resolved. Anyway, please do so now. This feedback is going to help us make decisions regarding the types of professional development opportunities that we offer. As a reminder, you're going to be receiving an email within the next week, if you registered for this webinar, that will include a link for further readings. It will also contain a link to the archived webinar. We hope you will share that link with your colleagues and get it out there on social media. Help us spread the word about what we're doing. If you've enjoyed tonight's webinar, please consider taking a graduate course in our MAG program. We have our online ones year-round, and then we have our week-long intensive seminars on campus in Ashland. Eric and Abby both teach in that program, as do I. You can find more information about our course offerings, as well as all sorts of other resources for teachers at teachingamericanhistory.org. As I said before, this is the first episode of Documents in Detail for the 2022-23 academic year. The program will return on Wednesday, October 26th. We will continue our focus on political parties. Eric is going to be back with us again. What document are we talking about then? It was
Progressive Party Platform of 1912.
Excellent. So we'll get a bit of a shift. We'll see the shift from the 19th century party system to the 20th century party system. In any case, thank you all for joining us tonight. We'll look forward to seeing you again next month. Good night.
Thanks again for listening to Teaching American History's webinar on Plunkitt of Tammany Hall. For more information on our webinars, in-person educator professional development programs, free document library, and graduate program, please visit us at th.org.